Hello. The partnership between Games Workshop and MB Games was responsible for the gateways that many young hobbyists first walked through: HeroQuest and Space Crusade. Both featured beautiful Citadel miniatures and set the standard for a genre of tabletop gaming for many years to come. The MBGW collaborations were designed by Stephen Baker, the man by whom all were conceived, and another game was made. In the lands of Warhammer, in the fires of MB, this brilliant designer forged in secret a master game to best them all. And into this game, he poured all his creativity, his vision, and his will to craft a full-scale wargame experience. One box to house it all. I'm Jordan, this is Jordan Sorcery, and today we're exploring the enormous history of Battle Masters. So this video has been a long time coming, the epic conclusion to my trilogy of videos about the history of the collaboration between Games Workshop and Milton Bradley. Battle Masters was the culmination of that relationship between the two tabletop icons, and it would also mark the capstone of Stephen Baker's initial career at MB. It completed his journey away from Games Workshop at the same time as forging an inseparable bond between his work and the, up to that point, workhorse of GW, Warhammer. Battle Masters is a two-player game released in 1992, played not on a board but instead on an absolutely absurdly massive vinyl playmat. Each player takes on the role of a mighty general leading a huge force into battle. On one side are the forces of Chaos, a ragtag horde composed of Chaos Warriors, Beastmen, Goblin Wolf Riders, Ogres, and more. On the other is the Imperial Army of the Empire, a more orderly force of knights, bowmen, halberdiers, and cannon. All of the units, represented by plastic Citadel miniatures, are mounted on unit bases, with multiple minis acting as one. Orders are given to the units using randomly drawn cards, dictating which can act and what they can do. And then the two armies clash in a battle to the death. This is a large-scale wargame set in the Empire of the Old World, conceptually placing the entirety of Warhammer Fantasy Battle into a single box. A very big box. But before we take to the battlefield, let's first remember the journey through dungeons and space hulks that got us here. And if you could leave a like whilst we do so, I would really appreciate it. The first MBGW game was, of course, HeroQuest, a dungeon diving board game inspired by D&D and featuring 4 Citadel heroes going up against, amongst other creatures, skeletons, orcs, Fimir, and the legendary Gargoyle. The game was a smash hit. It sold hundreds of thousands of copies worldwide and received a number of expansions and merch over the next few years. Love for this game is still so strong that the Hasbro branded remake has been a huge success as well. The follow-up to HeroQuest was the equally exciting, if not as commercially successful, sci-fi board game, Space Crusade. Unlike its older sibling, Space Crusade was not released in North America, and whilst its sci-fi version of the dungeon crawl made for an incredible game experience, it was probably not as long-lived or as well supported either. It did, however, take players into the 41st millennium, introducing many youngsters to their first Space Marines, Space Orcs, Eldar, and Gene Stealers. Even with 2 pretty terrific Citadel miniatures-based board games under his belt, Stephen Baker was still keen to explore other aspects of the miniatures hobby. If you want to get a full version of the story behind Stephen Baker's journey from GW to MB, then you can watch my videos on HeroQuest and Space Crusade right here. But suffice it to say that he was still eager to find a way to bring the totality of the Citadel miniatures experience into a single game. Given the scaled-down focus of those previous 2 games, I asked Stephen Baker what had inspired Battle Masters, and he sent me this response. I wanted to cover all the bases for miniature gaming, fantasy sci-fi RPG, and fantasy sci-fi tabletop battles. My goal with Battle Masters was to get 100 figures into the box, so it really felt like you had 2 armies. I have been a keen wargamer ever since I was young and collected a wide range of armies. I used rules by the likes of Charles Grant and Donald Featherstone. I have always loved playing things that have a great spectacle, anything with miniatures, dimensions, scale, or terrain.
Battle Masters. The game of orcs and ogres, wolf riders and more, versus knights and archers, and the cannons roar. Command your armies. You must not fail. It's good versus evil on an epic scale. Battle Masters from the makers of HeroQuest.
Gameplay needed to be quick, simple, and accessible, and many design decisions were made to ensure that younger players could easily open the box, learn the rules, and play a game. And to meet that brief of an entire war game in one box, it was absolutely stuffed with a huge number of miniatures, spread across two separate factions, the Imperial Army and the Forces of Chaos. The Imperial Army is 43 miniatures strong, organised into 11 based units. It features 9 hard-hitting Imperial Knights, 3 mounted Lord Knights, 15 men-at-arms, 10 Imperial Archers, 5 crossbowmen, and 1 Great Cannon with crew. Arrayed against them are the ruinous Forces of Chaos, composed of 14 unit bases and 60 separate miniatures. There are 10 Chaos Warriors armed with halberds, 10 Chaos Archers, 10 Orcs, 10 Goblins, 10 Beastmen, 6 Goblin Wolf Riders, 3 mounted Champions of Chaos, and 1 Ogre Champion carrying a rather large mace. The box came with an avalanche of stickers so that you could add distinguishing banners to each unit, as well as giving them all names and telling you what type of fighter are represented on each base. There was no way a board would be big enough to handle Battle Masters, so instead it came with a 55 by 57 inch vinyl playmat, similar to the kind of thing you would see in some physical family games available around the same era. The inspiration for the board initially came from a game MB launched in 1986 called Torpedo Run. The massive game board would allow for spaces that made movement no different than many family games. However, the box was too big for retail, and the cost of the enormous board took too many miniatures out of the game. That is when I had the idea to print on a twister mat. The original design for the game board had a unique piece of art for the whole mat. Unfortunately, the manufacturing process used rollers with a diameter of 68 centimeters. That is why you see the repeating pattern on the map. That map was given added variability by the inclusion of terrain feature tiles. Because movement across the map was handled using large hex spaces, it was possible to put a tile overlay on top of a hex to introduce barriers like ponds, trenches, and spiked barricades. There were even some plastic hedges in the box to obscure certain avenues of progression and add visual interest. And there was another feature that significantly changed the game board. Not quite a mighty fortress, but definitely a mighty tower. Constructed of hard plastic, the tower was designed to add some verticality and variability to the battlefield, and it can be garrisoned by troops for extra defense and even reduced to rubble. In a comment here on the channel, Rick Priestley shared his recollection of the inclusion of that tower. Brian Ansell's original design for BM envisaged a lot more troops, but MB insisted on expending a chunk of the budget on the tower model, which we all thought was crazy when you could have quite a lot of figures for the same plastic. The MB team insisted on including the tower to give the game verticality. We had a bit of to and fro on that. Stephen Baker remembered the reasoning behind the tower from his perspective. I was keen to have some dimensional element that could act as a focus for some scenarios, and a small border fort or tower seemed the most cost effective, and would add a tactical benefit. It would also help tell a better story on the box bottom, with two armies vying over a central terrain feature. One extra detail that Rick Priestley added was that Citadel's Brian Ansell was very much a key driver for the development of the game. In fact, BM was very much steered by Brian Ansell, who designed the game itself. So although it came out after Brian had left GW, that was only a matter of MB's timing. Stephen Baker, the only credited designer on Battle Masters, reflected on his memories of working with Brian Ansell on the various MB-GW collaborations. I got on well with Brian and met with him several times. He would also meet with the senior leadership folks at MB from design and marketing. Brian was keen for there to be a lot of miniatures. Gameplay is pretty quick and simple. Once all the units are deployed, you flip the top card of the battle cards deck to find out which unit can act next. Whichever unit is shown on the card gets to move and/or attack. There are a few special rules, like ranged troops can only move or attack, and some cavalry can move multiple times before attacking. But largely, a move is literally just moving from one hex to another. And there are some cards that can actually give you the opportunity to move your entire army in one go. So moving is a little random. You don't get to choose which of your units you're going to be using next. And in some cases, if you're unlucky, it can really go against you if the enemy gets to do lots of actions in quick succession. But combat is a little bit more equally balanced. Based on the combat strength of your unit, you get to roll a number of special d6, and you're looking for skulls. The defender rolls a number of dice equal to their combat strength, and they are looking for shields. Each defending shield removes one attacking skull, and then you count up how many skulls are left and deal that many wounds to the unit being attacked. With the exception of the Ogre Champion, every unit in the game can take only 3 wounds before being removed entirely. And that's mostly it for rules. There's a few bits and bobs here and there, but that's largely it. What is surprising is that although setup takes a long time, the actual gameplay is really quite quick because you're just moving, and drawing the cards to do so without having to make too many decisions about what you want to do. And there were a couple of units on each side that have their own special rules as well: the Mighty Cannon and the Ogre Champion. The cannon chooses a target up to 8 spaces away, and then must draw special cards for each space on the path to its target. If a flying cannonball card is drawn, then you go to the next hex and draw again. If a bouncing cannonball card is drawn, then it goes through the unit in the hex, dealing damage as it goes, even if it's your own troops. And then finally, you can draw an exploding cannonball card, in which case, that is where the cannonball lands. But if you get flying or bouncing cannonballs all the way along the path, then it will hit its target and destroy the entire unit that is there. The Ogre Champion, meanwhile, gets to draw extra cards from its own special card deck, which means it can actually end up moving and attacking as many as 3 times in a single go. To add some variety to gameplay, there was also a simple set of campaign rules included in the rulebook. This linked 5 separate scenarios that tell the story of Gorfist the Chaos Destroyer as he enters the Empire intent on decimating Altdorf. Each scenario featured predetermined deployment mechanisms for the armies and terrain features, and culminated in a battle at the gates of Altdorf for the fate of the Empire. Although, like in any game of Battlemasters, there were no real objectives for the scenarios beyond killing the enemy units, there was a rudimentary experience system, with surviving units being given an elite token that clipped into the unit base. That meant that in the next game, they could roll more dice in combat, making them far more valuable across the course of the campaign. Given the large physical scale of the components, the number, the size of everything in the box, it's perhaps no surprise that this was a tough game to demo for people, including, as Stephen Baker remembers, the MB Games top brass who wanted to understand how the game development was progressing. It was a difficult game to present in management line reviews. The presentation room was designed to show regular board games and toys. Battlemasters had to be set up in the break during the regular presentation. Early prototypes were made with existing GW miniatures and painted. The mats were printed on canvas and looked awesome. And of course, all of those plastic and card and vinyl components meant that putting everything into a single container was going to be tough as well. The box size was a challenge. It was the biggest box the factory could make. I'm glad we landed where we did, as it gave us a huge area for the box front art. Chris Baker, no relation, did an awesome job capturing all of the characters in a classic battle scene. Reception to Battlemasters appears to have been a game of 2 armies. On the one hand, the low relative cost, only about $30 in some US stores, and the large volume of high-quality plastic minis included in the box made it quite appealing. But on the other side, the simplicity and seeming lack of strategic depth made it harder for some reviewers to recommend to seasoned gamers. In Dragon issue 188, Rick Swan's review for Battlemasters was mixed. That the contents of the Battlemasters box are impressive, stunningly so, is self-evident. The dozens of plastic pieces, detailed down to the bolts on the Warhammers and scowls on the goblins, are a miniaturist's dream. I played this several times with some grade school kids, and unlike us grumpy perfectionists, every one of them adored it. They didn't care about the inflexible movement rules. They just liked the idea of a game big enough to fill the living room floor. Players willing to overlook the conceptual problems may have a good time in spite of themselves. It's fast, surprisingly balanced, and a snap to learn, and there's an undeniable pleasure to be had from fondling all of those pieces. Mitch Lavender, reviewing the game for Challenge Magazine issue 74, was similarly impressed by the contents of the box, but had reservations about key mechanics. The largest shortcoming of the game is that too much depends on the random drawing of cards, which consequently determines which units get to move and attack. If this is too one-sided early in the game, it can be devastating to the other player's forces. If you like fast-moving, highly playable games, and especially if you like hefty mammoth-sized games, Battlemasters will probably appeal to you. If you are looking for a pure strategy game, you needn't look twice at Battlemasters. The simplistic and random determination of movement and combat have latitude for formulation of only superficial strategies. Not content with the number of miniatures included in the base box, MB Games set about creating 2 expansions that would give you even more of the same. The Imperial Lords box had 25 minis, including another cannon, more halberdiers, knights, archers, and crossbowmen. The equivalent box for their enemies was the Chaos Warband expansion, which gave players 24 new miniatures with more beastmen, ogres, and mounted Chaos Lords. This was largely a marketing sales decision. As with the first 2 HeroQuest expansions, there was no budget for additional tooling of new miniatures. Neither was there any real budget for design. Baker went on to expand on what his plans would have been for further expansions if he'd stayed with MB Games. The game system had all the core troops baked into the card deck. The only way to add new miniatures was to create additional specialized characters that could have their own card, similar to the Ogre and Mighty Cannon. When I left MB, or Hasbro as it had become, I had 2 new expansions in design. The first was for a giant who had a mini deck. He was like a super ogre and drew 2 cards from his deck every time a giant card was drawn. The player could then choose which one to play and which to discard. He was a little less erratic than the ogre. For the Imperial forces, there were plans for a mounted general and wizard. Similar to the giant, these characters had their own cards that would go into the deck. The general could activate other units he was adjacent to. The wizard had a bunch of spells for offensive, defensive, and healing. The giant was sculpted, but I had not seen anything on the general or wizard by the time I left. These were not the only Battlemasters products that went unreleased though. According to Baker, in the same way that HeroQuest had received a sci-fi sibling, Battlemasters could have had a 40k version. I designed a Warhammer 40k Battlemasters. This was an early prototype and was fully playable before I left Hasbro. It was to be in a smaller box, and instead of the plastic map, it had a dozen double-sided 1-foot card tiles. These could be arranged in multiple ways and provided an easy visual reference for what were to be the scenarios. The game was to come with some 3D card and plastic terrain. It also included rhinos that were also part plastic and part card. The game was more turn-based, and this would have allowed for easier expansions, adding new units and terrain. I am unsure what happened to this concept, or if the GW team ever reviewed it. Wellity, a Warhammer 40,000 version of Battlemasters. That's definitely something I would have loved to have played. I remember the original Battlemasters was always set up in my friend Rob's attic. It was not a game that we played very often, but we did take a look at it and admire all of those amazing miniatures that were included in the box, and of course, that enormous playmat that was just absurd. As a gateway to wargaming proper, it seems that Battlemasters was relatively successful. You can still see a lot of talk about the game popping up here and there in general GW discussions, but as a family-friendly board game, it doesn't seem as profitable as MB may have hoped. With Baker no longer there to champion the development, having left MB shortly after its launch, and sales not as high as the mega success of HeroQuest, it seems that Battlemasters was left to fade away. Though, in his second stint at Hasbro 10 years later, Baker would develop something a little bit like Battlemasters, another wargame adjacent board game, one that spawned a legacy of its own. But let's leave HeroScape for another time. Oh, and did you know that there was a 4th collaboration planned between MB Games and Games Workshop? It was about battle wizards racing chariots around a track and trying to fight each other using their spells. They even made miniatures for this game, even though it never got released. I've actually made a video all about it, which you can check out right here. I hope that you've enjoyed spending some time with me talking about Battlemasters, the final game in the collaborative relationship between Milton Bradley and Games Workshop. It has been an unexpectedly long journey to get here, a trilogy of stories that have been really fun to tell, and huge thanks go out to Stephen Baker for answering my many questions about HeroQuest and Space Crusade and Battlemasters. I will be putting the entirety of that written interview onto my website. I've linked it below, so you can go and check that out if you want to find all of the extra detail that I just couldn't fit into this video. Why not leave a comment about your favorite memories of the MB-GW collaborations? Did you play Battlemasters? Was it terrific? Do you prefer HeroQuest? Do you prefer Space Crusade? Talk about your favorites in the comments down below. And if you want to support me in making more videos like this history, then you can do so at my Patreon or my Ko-fi, or even just by joining my Discord. I've put links to all of those in the description. Thank you very much for watching. I'm Jordan, and this is Jordan Sorcery. Crossbowman of Altdorf, you say? I don't know. I think you look more like Crossbowman of Marienburg to me.